the Middle podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers? Welcome to the first episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck. This is the podcast that is dedicated to the music, movie, culture of Generation X. And I guess it's important because it's the very first episode to kind of establish why I even decide to start this podcast. So it's kind of equal parts nostalgia, equal parts the ridiculousness of middle age, particularly as I'm coming up on the 30-year high school reunion. So 30 years since I graduated high school, which makes it 1992. And of course, maybe it's just because I lived it, but that to me seems peak Gen X. We'll kind of get into what's happened in those years and why I think that's peak Gen X. But as we're going through the podcast, we're going to go through all different time periods. But let's establish a couple of things. So why the name? Why the name Stuck in the Middle? Well, one of the best films of 1992 was a little movie called The Reservoir Dogs by some guy called Quentin Tarantino. And I'm sure he's going to be a recurring topic. I know he's going to be a recurring topic on the show because so much of what he's done in film, coming from this generation, I think has still made lasting impacts, and he continues to make really great work. But there was this kind of famous torture scene for anyone who's seen Reservoir Dogs. I don't mean to be giving any spoilers 30 years later, but nevertheless, Michael Madsen, who's chewing up the scenery, he is Mr. Blonde, and he is about to torture a cop that they have captured. It's a movie about a heist that's gone wrong. Well, anyway, as he's going ahead and about to torture this cop, he decides to turn on the radio, and it's the Golden Oldie station. And one of the songs that comes on is Stuck in the Middle by Stealers Wheels. And then he proceeds to, go ahead and torture the cop. But what's interesting is that that song was from the 70s, but it was coming into a current context, and it actually became kind of a radio hit, as did, that soundtrack in general, and Tarantino's known for his soundtrack. But I couldn't help but kind of hear that phrase, stuck in the middle, somewhere else. So when I got into my 30s, I kind of recognized that I thought that our generation had some cultural significance, but in some ways it's kind of a lost generation. And I read this article, and it stated that Generation X is stuck in the middle between two larger and more boisterous generations. I love that. Boisterous generations. So that Stealers Wheels song that was in Reservoir Dogs, it has a famous lyric, but I always hear it this way. And it says, "Boomers on the left of me, millennials on the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. And a podcast is born." So it's probably important to even define what Generation X is. Now, chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, either A, I know you and thank you for listening to the podcast, or you're from Generation X, so you kind of know what it is. But it's interesting is because there are different people that I've met throughout my life that kind of consider themselves Gen X or on the cusp of Gen X. So what are the years? So the driest definition that I found was from the Social Security Administration of the U.S. government, which states that those born between 1964 and 1979 would be considered Gen X. But the same government, our U.S. Department of Defense, says 1965 to 1977. Others say 61 to 81, 65 to 84. Now, the variations are slight overall, but I'm going to go with that 64 to 79 because that makes sense to me just from people that I know and interacted with throughout my life. So there are some terms other than Gen X that have been associated kind of with the generation. Latchkey kids, I was one of those. We were called baby busters as a generation because it's a play on the baby boomers since the birth rates for our generation, which is why we're the smaller one that's, stuck in the middle. And that's a whole, discourse on sociology that we can get into, but we'll skip that for now. We've also been called, as I started the show, I said slackers, which is interesting because, at least, again, from my own context, I've been called that. I've been called a slacker, and I've basically been continuously employed in some way or another since I was like 12 years old. Mowing lawns And then, 14, get a worker's permit, work at the grocery store, then, worked at a pharmacy, did deliveries. I was a short order cook at a Friendly's in my hometown. I've always been working, except for really a brief period before I ended up moving from Meriden, Connecticut, which is where I'm from. And Meriden will also be something that we'll talk about on the podcast, because during these years I was there. So it's this kind of very Northeast vibe in how we experience Generation X, which is different than some of the guests that I'll probably have that are from different areas and even different parts of the world, and how that Gen X generation really interacted with culture, and how music and film and all those things bisected each other in different ways. So when I was doing research for the show, just so I had some pertinent information and could say, okay, what is this generational thing? I came across this tidbit that I'd never actually heard before. It says that there is something, now this is from 2014, and it describes something called Xennials. And Xennials made the dictionary in 2020. Amazing. But we'll just take Wikipedia's definition here. And it says Xennials are the micro-generation of people on the cusp of Gen X and millennial demographic cohorts. Research in popular media used birth years from the late 1970s to the early 1980s, and Xennials are described as having had an analog childhood and a digital young adulthood. Now, the whole thing kind of makes me laugh, because that's really how I think I would describe most of us who would fall within Generation X. So there's always this group of people like, well, I don't belong to this group, or I don't belong to that group, and I think that's very much kind of a part of the rebelliousness of youth. And it's like, why? I don't really think I'm part of this group or that group. Or you simply prefer elements of the culture of a different generation. When I talk about music, my earliest memories of music is actually Queen and Judas Priest and Earth, Wind & Fire and the Commodores. But I also say that, some of my favorite bands are the emo bands of, the 2000s, or really late 90s, early 2000s. So I could go ahead and listen to Earth, Wind & Fire like I did the other night, or listen to My Chemical Romance. And to me, that makes perfect sense. So when I see this, kind of description of these Xennials, I'm like, okay, well, what's the cutoff for that? It just seems a little bit silly, because there's some other things about this description that I find so interesting. Xennials were the first generation to experience growing up with computers and the internet at home. Okay, yeah, I check off that box. Mind you, having a mom in IT and an early adopter is helpful there. Xennials grew up without Facebook, Twitter, or even Friendster and MySpace, but they are as savvy as their millennial counterparts when it comes to social media. Okay, well, I use social media too. The first cell phone went out when Xennials were in their 20s. Me too. Prior to that, they had to use old rotary phones to call their friends' homes. Yes, rotary phones, but everyone was really excited when they got the pulse dial phones. They witnessed firsthand how the music industry transitioned from buying cassette tapes to downloading a song on Napster. They kind of forgot that there were CDs in between there, but I digress. And then finally, Xennials may have experienced the worst effects of the recession due to low unemployment rates and piling student loan debts. Well, yeah, that's kind of how it goes. Recessions every 10 years or so. Sometimes we get them back to back. It's just the cycles of economy, and every single generation can claim that last one, I think, to some extent. But I guess it also annoyed me because I remember seeing something that talked about this generation had Star Wars their whole lives. And I'm like, well, Star Wars has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. And it's really one of my earliest memories with Star Wars. I know I'm jumping all over the place, but that's kind of how my brain works. But Star Wars really has been a lifelong influence. So being born in 1974, I don't recall exactly if I was, 3 years old, 1977, when the original Star Wars came out. But I can tell you, I remember seeing it at a drive-in theater. And those of you who have never had the pleasure of going to a drive-in theater, it was just one of the most fun things as a kid. So we would go. My dad had a van. He had one of those, just old-fashioned vans. They have a nickname for them, and I'll talk about that in a minute because it's also a curiosity that was happening during this time period. But anyway, you'd have this van, and I forget where the drive-in was, either Southington or Plainville, Connecticut, something like that. Someone, go ahead and tweet me or send me a message about where that was. It's been a long time. I know I could look it up on the internet. Anyway, we would get to be about, 5 minutes out from actually arriving there. And my dad would have all of us. So he would have, his girlfriend. My parents were divorced. So he'd have his girlfriend in the passenger seat, and there'd be a bunch of us in the back. And I guess back then they charged you per person that was in the van. I don't know if there was a minimum or a maximum or whatever it was. But nevertheless, my dad had all these pillows that were in the back. Because basically, people used these vans as their rolling living rooms, It was a place to go ahead and drink and smoke pot and do other things. Sorted things. So he had all these pillows lining the floor. So he'd pull over to the side of the road, he'd open up the back, and all of us passengers in the back, including me, the little kid, would get covered up with all these pillows. So if you were to open it up and look in the back, there's nobody there, it's just pillows. And then he'd happily drive in and pay whatever the lowest possible price that he could, and then we'd drive inside and we'd go, pop open the back doors, and for those of you who don't know, the audio came from this little speaker that you had. Nowadays, if you go to a drive-in, they actually can just do it through your radio and one of the frequencies there. But back then, it had this weird metal thing. It looked like a microphone, and you hung it on your window, and that's where you got the audio. So I don't think this was any stereo, pretty much mono. Nevertheless, we go, and it's a double feature. Now, one of the biggest stars in the world, and continues to be a huge star as a director and still, being in films, is Clint Eastwood. Huge when I was a kid. And there was a double feature of one of the Dirty Harry movies. I think it was Dirty Harry. I don't know. I was little. And Star Wars. Now, usually the rated R movie would go on last. But Star Wars was such a phenomenon that it was the headliner. So basically, I had to sleep through the Dirty Harry movie because it would be completely inappropriate for me to watch. And when that was over, I was woken up. And my dad's like, hey, Star Wars is starting. So again, I don't know if this was 77. I do know that it was in drive-in for a long time afterwards. So maybe this was 78, 79, I don't know. But I just remember the opening scene. Now, I couldn't read yet. I know that. Maybe a couple of words. So I had no idea what was going on. And I was like, holy cow. And I saw the two ships come over. And it was just this real, I don't know, it's a seminal moment, in film, but also I think in so many of our youths of Star Wars just being such a big part of it. And it really is kind of such a pleasant memory, such a pleasant memory. But what's also curious is I mentioned the van. So those vans were so popular then, but for both positive and negative reasons. So part of the reason they kind of became passé was twofold. One, the advent of the soccer mom's vehicle of choice, the suburban family vehicle of choice, the minivan. But also those vans had this negative stigma. They were being called rape vans. And you see them, and it makes perfect sense. And back then, when I first heard that term, I was like, oh, okay, I can see why they'd be called that. But I didn't know that was very literal. Because around this time, so somewhere in the, let's see, from like 77 to like 81, there was a serial killer boom, particularly in California, and these vans were a big part of that. So I didn't know any of this when I was a kid. It was like, okay, well, those are just no longer a thing. Now we have minivans. Some people got panel vans. Some people just got the station wagons, and then Subarus became a big thing for families. But there was the serial killer boom. So there's this great documentary that I watched recently, and I say great only in the fact that it was well done, about the Toolbox Killers, which you might have heard about. So Lawrence Bittaker, Roy Norris, William Bonin was known as the Freeway Killer.